Okay. Chapter 2. Wow. Great. Okay. Holt stood motionless against the massive trunk of an oak tree as the bandits swarmed out of the forest to surround the carriage. He was in full view, but nobody saw him. In part, this was due to the fact that the robbers were totally intent on their prey, a wealthy merchant and his wife. For their part, they were equally distracted, staring with horror at the armed men who now surrounded their carriage in the clearing, but in the main it was due to the camouflage cloak that Holt wore, its cowl pulled up over his head to leave his face in shadows, and the fact that he stood absolutely stock still, like all rangers. Holt knew the secret of merging into the background lay with the ability to remain unmoving, even when people seemed to be looking straight at him. Believe you are unseen, went the rangers saying, and it will be so. A burly figure clad entirely in black now emerged from the trees and approached the carriage. Holt's eyes narrowed for a second. Then he sighed silently. Another wild goose chase, he thought. The figure bore a slight resemblance to Folder, the man Holt had been pursuing since the end of the war with Morgarth. Folder had been Morgarth's senior lieutenant. He had managed to escape capture when his leader died and his army of subhuman Wargles faded away. But Folder was no mindless beast. He was a thinking, planning human being, and a totally warped and evil one. The son of a noble Arelyn family, he had murdered both his parents after an argument over a horse. He was barely a teenager at the time, and he had escaped by fleeing into the mountains of Rain and Night, where Morgarth recognized a kindred spirit and enlisted him. Now he was the sole surviving member of Morgarth's band, and King Duncan had made his capture and imprisonment a #1 priority for the kingdom's armed forces. The problem was, Folder impersonators were springing up everywhere, usually in the form of everyday bandits like this one. They used the man's name and savage reputation to strike fear into their victims, making it easier to rob them. And as each one sprang up, Holt and his colleagues had to waste time tracking them down. He felt a slow burning of anger at the time he was wasting on these minor nuisances. Holt had other matters to attend to. He had a promise to keep, and fools like this were preventing him from doing so. The fake Folder had stopped by the carriage now. The black cloak with its high collar was somewhat similar to the one Folder wore, but Folder was a dandy, and his cloak was immaculate black, velvet and satin, whereas this was simple wool, badly dyed and patched in several places, with a collar of crudely tanned black leather. The man's bonnet was unkempt and badly creased as well, while the black swan's feathers that adorned it was bent in the middle, probably where some careless bandit had sat on it. Now the man spoke, and his attempt to imitate Felder's lisping sarcastic tones was spoiled by his thick rural accent and clumsy grammar. "Step down from the carriage, good sir and madam," he said, sweeping a clumsy bow, "and fear not, good lady, the noble Felder ne'er harm one so fair as thee art." He attempted a sardonic, evil laugh. It came out more as a thin cackle. The good lady was anything but fair. She was middle-aged, overweight, and plain in the extreme, but that was no reason why she should be subjected to this sort of terror. Holt thought grimly. She held back, whimpering with fear as the sight of the black figure before her. Felder took a pace forward, his voice harsher, his tone more threatening. "Get down, missus," he shouted, "or I'll hand you your husband's ears." His right hand dropped to the hilt of a long dagger in his belt. The woman cried out and cowered further back into the carriage. Her husband, equally terrified and more than fond of his ears, where they were, was trying to push it towards the carriage door. Enough, Holt thought. Satisfied that no one was looking in his direction, he knocked an arrow, drew and sighted in one economical motion and released. Faldor, real name Rupert Gobblestone, had a brief impression of something flashing past, just in front of his nose. Oh yeah, it was nose. Wow. Then there was an almighty jerk on the raised collar of his cloak, and he found himself pinned against the carriage by a quivering black arrow that thudded into the wood. He gave a startled yelp, lost his balance, and stumbled, saved from falling by his cloak, which now began to choke him where it fastened around his neck. As the other bandits turned to see where the arrow had come from, Holt stepped away from the tree, yet to the startled robbers it seemed as if he had stepped out of the massive oak. "King's Ranger!" Holt called. "Drop your weapons." There were 10 men, all armed. Not a single one thought of to disobey the order. Knives, swords, and cludges clattered to the ground. They had just seen a first-hand example of a ranger's black magic. The grim figure had stepped clean out of the living trunk of an oak tree. Even now the starter cloak that he wore seemed to shimmer uncertainly against the background, making it difficult to focus on him. And if sorcery wasn't enough to compel them, they could see a more practical reason: the massive longbow with another black shafted arrow already on the strings. On the ground, belly down, all of you." The words cut at them like a whip, and they dropped to the ground. Holt pointed to one, a dirty-faced youth who couldn't have been more than 15. "Not you," he said, and the boy hesitated, on his hands and knees. "You take their belts and tie their hands behind them." The terrified boy nodded several times, then moved towards the first of his prone comrades. He stopped as Holt gave him a further warning. "Tie them tight," he said. "If I find one loose, I'll—" He hesitated for a second, while he framed a suitable threat, then continued, "I'll seal you up inside that oak tree over there." That should do it, he thought. He was aware of the effect that his unexplained appearance from the tree had on these uneducated country folk. It was a device he had used many times before. Now he saw the boy's face whiten with fear under the dirt, and knew the threat was effective. He turned his attention to Gobblestone, who was plucking feebly at the thong securing his cloak as it continued to choke him. He was already red in the face, his eyes bulging. They bulged further as Holt unsheathed his heavy sax knife. "Oh, relax," said Holt irritably. He slashed quickly through the cord, and Gobblestone, suddenly released, fell awkwardly to the ground. He seemed content to stay there, out of the reach of that gleaming knife. Holt glanced up at the occupants of the carriage. The relief on their faces was all too obvious. "I think you can be on your way if you like," he said pleasantly. "These idiots won't bother you any further." The merchant, remembering quite guiltily how he had tried to shove his wife out of the carriage, tried to cover his discomfort by blustering, "They deserve hanging, Ranger, hanging, I say. They have terrified my poor wife and threatened my very person." Holt eyed the man impassively until the outburst was finished. "Worse than that," he said quietly. "They've wasted my time." "The answer is no," Holt said Crowley, just as it was the last time you asked. He could see the anger in every line of Holt's body as his old friend stood before him. Crowley hated what he had to do, but orders were orders, and as the Ranger commandant, it was his job to enforce them, and Holt, like all Rangers, was bound to obey them. "You don't need me," Holt burst out. "I'm wasting time hunting these imitation Felders all over the kingdom when I should be looking for going after Will." The king has made Folder our #1 priority, Crowley reminded him. Sooner or later we'll find the real one. Holt made a dismissive gesture. And you have 49 other rangers to do the job, he said. For God's sake, that should be enough. King Duncan wants the other 49, and he wants you. He trusts you and depends on you. You're the best we have. I've done my share, Holt replied quietly, and Crowley knew how much it hurt the other man to say those words. He also knew that his best reply would be silence that would force Holt further into this sort of rationalization that Crowley knew he hated. The kingdom owes that boy, Holt said with a little more certainty in his tone. The boy is a ranger, Crowley said coldly. An apprentice, Holt corrected him, and now Crowley stood, knocking his chair over with the violence of his movement. A range apprentice assumes the same duties as a ranger. We always have, Holt. For every ranger the rule is the same. Kingdom first. That's our oath. You took it, I took it, and so did Will. There was an angry silence between the two men, made all the uglier by the years they had lived as friends and comrades. Holt, Crowley realized, was possibly his closest friend in the world. Now here they were, trading bitter words and angry arguments. He reached behind him and straightened the fallen chair, then made a gesture of peace to Holt. Look, he said in a milder tone, just help me clear up the Folder's business. 2 months, maybe 3, then you can go after Will, with my blessing. Holt's grizzled head was already shaking before he'd finished. In 2 months he could be dead, or sold on as a slave and lost forever. I need to go now while the trail is still warm. I promised him, he added after a pause, his voice thick with misery. No, said Crowley with a note of finality. Hearing it, Holt squared his shoulders. Then I'll see the king, he said. Crowley looked down at his desk. The king won't see you, he said flatly. He looked up and saw the surprise and betrayal in Holt's eyes. He won't see me. He refuses me. For over 20 years, Holt had been one of the king's closest confidants, with constant, unquestionable access to the royal chambers. He knows what you ask, Holt. He doesn't want to refuse you, so he refuses to see you. Now the surprise and betrayal were gone from Holt's eyes. In their place was anger, bitter anger. Then I'll just have to change his mind, he said quietly. Oh, lol, you couldn't even see that. I'm sorry. Okay, well, thank you for listening to me read chapter 2. If you'd like to listen to me read chapter 3, then please stay tuned, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.